All right. Hi, everyone. So we're going to get started. I'm sure people are still going to be popping in and stuff. But to kick it off, today we're going to be talking about side hustles. So, to kind of give you guys an overview of what we're going to be going through today, we're going to start off with a little bit of introduction. Then, after that, we're going to go about defining what a side hustle is exactly, since that term gets thrown around quite a bit these days. Then, after that, we are going to talk about different ways that you can find a side hustle that appeals to you. And following that, we will talk about enhancing your side hustle skill set. So that includes anything about certifications or like just a general knowledge of ways to self improve. Then, following that, we'll be talking about sustainable impact and considerations, and then going into a question and answer portion. Okay, so without further ado, we are general intelligences, obviously, and you can check us out at our website. We also have an Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and a TikTok, of course, as well. And we do post recordings of all of our video programming to the YouTube channel as well. And just a quick note, it's generalintelligences.org and not .com. So what we do is we host monthly webinars with guest speakers sometimes and also presentations sometimes as well. Kind of depends on what we have going on that month. Then we also have some free resources. We have articles and networking opportunities. Um, Most of you are here because you're on our monthly email list. And we also use that as an avenue to send out our monthly e-magazine, which is mostly directed towards first generation and low income students. But really, that kind of information is just really pertinent to, I think, any college student. So, to start off with, we're going to start with defining what a side hustle is. So, a side hustle is any kind of employment that you take on in addition to any sort of full time job or full time career, full time studies. So basically, it's something that is like freelance usually, done kind of like on your own extra time. And it basically, people do it because it provides you with another income. And it's usually something that someone is passionate about. So it gives you an opportunity to explore things that maybe you didn't like major in or specialize in. But it still gives you an opportunity to do that like hobby for money. And so with the internet and TikTok is really big right now. It seems like a lot of people have been, starting and investing more in themselves. And I think a byproduct of that is we see more and more people beginning their side hustles. So that's really cool. So some examples of some side hustles would include a Shopify store. So I think actually on most online stores, you can tell if it's a Shopify store because they'll have something at like the bottom of their website. But basically, any sort of online store that needs help with distribution of any like clothes or like whatever else they sell would go through Shopify, just as kind of like an easier way to do it. Um, you see that quite a bit again on TikTok. Freelance writing is another option. That one's been a popular option for years. Um, Whether that's like ghostwriting or like writing articles or just like pieces on like a case by case basis. Usually they'll pay you by like word count, but you can basically be writing for individuals or organizations for that. Then there are also online courses. So, teaching and charging for an online course in an area of expertise. So, that kind of is very similar to maybe, for example, tutoring or something like that, where you are, telling somebody about a little bit more about a certain subject matter and kind of expanding their knowledge on it. But for online courses, a lot of them are more so on soft skills. So that could be anything from like, how to be like a leader, or it could be stuff like, communicating and how to do that more efficiently or effectively. Another one that you probably see quite a bit on social media is being a brand ambassador. So, obviously, in addition to getting some free stuff, it's pretty nice that a lot of these people are able to actually earn some money for each of the posts as well. And I think quite a few people have been branching off into doing that if they do have a pretty substantial social media following. And so basically what you would do is you post about the brand, or sometimes you even just use your own photos and put something in the caption. And it's just a really easy way to kind of earn money. And the only requirement, of course, is to have above a certain set of like followers, and also to have a set amount of engagement. So obviously you can't just go ahead and buy like 10,000 followers and then have, 20 likes on a picture. Brands are aware of that, so that's something to consider. Food delivery has been really big since COVID-19 kind of, took over. I know quite a few of my friends personally work with like Grubhub or DoorDash or Uber Eats. And those are just an example of like some of the different platforms. But basically, what you do is for them, you just go and pick up their food orders and deliver it to them. And in many cases, that's contactless completely. So it's not like you're posing any sort of like risk to yourself by like interacting with all of these people. Well, besides, I mean, picking up the food at the store. So it's a pretty good option for someone that has like a reliable form of transportation, and a license, of course. But if you don't, then obviously you need to have that as a consideration as well. And then photography is obviously a big one too. I think it's suffering a little bit right now just because of the pandemic, but I think in a normal year you would see all of those posts about people taking photos of all of these events, like, wedding photography or like graduation photos or stuff like that. So I think photography is also a pretty common one. And on college campuses, probably the most common form of like photography that's advertised on like different groups and stuff would be headshots. Because as you're, entering the workforce, a lot of applications are going to require a headshot. So people that do have like a camera and a pretty good like skill set, or maybe even a portfolio that they can show, would really be benefiting. So I just wanted to put this out there because I think people might not necessarily realize how common it is. Unfortunately or fortunately, I guess it depends how you look at it. Um, it is for Americans to have a side hustle. So again, a side hustle being something that is a supplemental income in addition to their, primary sort of employment. So 45%, that's pretty much almost half, and that's risen quite a bit in the past like 5 or so years. And again, key point to kind of draw attention to is that a lot of people answered in this poll that they actually had more than one side hustle. So I think kind of as we can see here, a lot of people are branching out into doing different things in addition to their, day-to-day, maybe 9 to 5 sort of work. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that it's getting more and more expensive to live in a lot of different places. But I think that's obviously a topic for another time. So, just to kind of talk about why a lot of people have been going into side hustles. For a lot of people, it has to do with having some more spending money, or money that they can put towards, bills or student loans or stuff like that. And, for a good chunk of people as well, they might not make enough money in their primary job to put any money aside, basically, to save. And as I'm sure most of you know, it's really quite important to save as young as possible. And it kind of puts you at a pretty significant disadvantage if you're not investing as soon as possible. But for a lot of Americans that are living, paycheck to paycheck, it's just not possible to save anything at all. If anything, like it's kind of hard to even, make ends meet. So I think that's probably why the appeal of side hustles has really grown quite a bit. And then again, so do side hustles come from hobbies? In a lot of cases, yes, they do. So for example, we talked about like photography or like giving like a course or something like that as like a side hustle. So a lot of times that comes from kind of just an interest. And then you take that interest and you think, okay, maybe there's some way that I can, in some form, kind of monetize it. Of course, I think it kind of depends on you and how much time you're willing to dedicate towards it. I don't think that you should be trying to turn all of your hobbies into side hustles that make you money. Definitely, hobbies are really important for your mental health, and not having to, worry about having another job and dealing with customers and stuff like that is really important. I think for anyone that's ever worked in retail, probably ever, you definitely know that working with customers can sometimes be quite a challenge, and quite a bit of stress. So I think that that's something to take into consideration when you're deciding whether or not to turn a certain one of your hobbies into a side hustle. So again, just to give you some statistics on that, Vistaprint found that 27% of full-time workers started making money from a hobby, and another 55% said that they'd like to turn a hobby into a business. So clearly, there is quite a bit of appeal to doing something that you love, and getting paid for it. So not completely shocking there, but something to consider. So, next thing is exploring some side hustle options, which I'm presuming is why most of you are here to kind of see what you can kind of contribute, and maybe some ways that you can go about, earning some more of that discretionary income or income that you can put towards paying bills or even saving. So, to brainstorm some side hustle options, I think the best place to start is to kind of have some degree of introspection. So, I think the first couple of questions you need to ask yourself are, what skills or talents do I have or think that I can cultivate before starting? And then, are any of those skills or talents interconnected? So, for a lot of people, maybe you could say something like, as an example, would be, maybe you say that you have a soft skill of really being pretty good about communication, and then you have another skill with writing. So I think for someone like that, it would be a pretty good idea to consider things that have to do with maybe journalism, or any sort of like freelance writing, just because you're combining your skill sets with things that you are already good at. Which is not to say that you shouldn't do something that maybe you've never done before. I think there's definitely merits to learning how to do something that you haven't tried before. But just recognize that that's going to take a little bit more time, and you don't want to be learning kind of as you go along because people are relying on you to provide that, because they're paying you for it. So in terms of the next things you should be asking, you should definitely ask what are some things that, you're personally interested in and how much time each week you have to spare. So I think that the most important thing when people are deciding whether or not to do a side hustle is to consider how much time realistically you want to spend on it each week. And I think for a lot of people, that's quite a challenge because they usually think that, people usually just tend to overestimate how much time they have to dedicate to things. And even if you don't overestimate it, I think you still need to be reasonable and have some time set aside for like things that are not, work. Like I said, that's very important not only for your mental health, but just to, be with your family and, just get stuff done, other things that you have to do on a day to day. So it's just not realistic to fill up, all 24 hours of every single day with such like a strict schedule. So make sure that you have like enough room in your schedule to allow for that kind of flexibility. Um, and I think it's also important to kind of weigh out the pros and cons as well. So I think quite a few people, especially when they're saving up for something, whether it's like applying for like grad school, which like grad school apps are quite expensive these days, um, or, just anything else like saving up for a trip or, you know, paying back student loans or something like that. I think a lot of people do take on more than one job anyway because it's just not feasible to kind of like live off of just one minimum wage job these days. It just isn't. And so I think that for people, especially that are doing that, where they're working, two or maybe even three jobs, I think it's probably a good idea to consider whether or not you can make more in a side hustle than in one of your jobs. And of course, you don't want to get rid of all of your jobs at once, thinking that, like, oh, I'm going to hit it big with like one of these side hustles. But I think it would be a good idea to kind of weigh out the pros and cons, kind of see how much they're paying you at your job, how many hours you're putting in, and whether or not um, that is working for you. So again, kind of to go into depth about pros and cons of side hustles, I think there are some clear pros. So obviously, you can explore stuff that you already like to do, which is huge. And you can also get paid. So I think a lot of people, especially college students or college graduates, a lot of people don't really major in the thing that they love, just because they don't necessarily think that it's like financially sustainable, or because they've been told to be like more realistic, or because they maybe have majored in that and haven't been able to find like a more full-time job, or know someone that that happened to. So I think that this is a pretty nice opportunity for you to kind of have like a mini career in a bunch of different things. And I think that that's also really a good thing to consider because a lot of people, go through stuff like burnout. And I think that having side hustles and things that you really genuinely enjoy doing, in addition to stuff that you just consider to be work, I think that there's definitely benefits to that in terms of reducing like your burnout. And then obviously there's flexibility in hours and tasks. And you do have a great deal of autonomy on your time because basically, if you think about it, you are self pricing how much your time is worth. You're setting your own prices, you're setting your own terms. Obviously, you are working around other people's schedules for certain side hustles and stuff like that, along with any sort of deadlines, but basically, within reason, you are setting what a day-to-day schedule looks like for you. So I think for a lot of people that are not type A, that really does appeal because some days you might just wake up feeling a little bit lazier than other days, and this allows you to kind of take that day off whenever you need to. And then another pro is obviously financial freedom. So, like we saw earlier on that graph, quite a few people do take up some sort of side hustle to ensure that they have some more discretionary income that they can spend, or again, for saving or paying off, bills and stuff like that. So, it just reduces stress overall financially. So, I think that that's a big asset. Then for some cons, again, you do want to consider these, and make sure that obviously the pros do outweigh the cons for you personally. One of them would be you might have less free time to relax or spend with your friends and family. A lot of people, like I said, tend to kind of underestimate how much time something is going to take. And also, when you love something, quite often the case is that you put more time into it, and you might not necessarily feel it. So it's very important to not let that like get in the way of any sort of your important relationships in life, and just your peace of mind. Because it's really easy to kind of get trapped in that cycle of, you have work or school in the morning, then you work on your side hustle when you get home, and then it's 9 or maybe even like 11 p.m. or something like that, and you've had basically no time to really truly like relax. So I think that that's important to consider and to balance. And then also another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes it's a little bit tricky for a lot of people to report how much you may earn for tax purposes. I think that's a little bit different Depending on whether you get someone to help you with your taxes, like go to CPA or something like that, or if you use some sort of like online software. So I think it's a little bit variable in that regard. But I think for most people, it's a little bit hard to kind of keep track of how much money you're making on those things because a lot of times those interactions are in cash, which most of the time people don't really report cash, kind of like how they don't report like tips. So I think that that's something to keep in mind, but at the same time, you want it to be legal. So in case they find out that, oh, you've been doing this like side hustle, and then you say like, yeah, but I made like $0, they're gonna be like, obviously that's suspicious. So just keep that in mind as well. And then obviously, like I said about working with, retail, there's bound to be some bad customer experiences or interactions. I know quite a few people, especially that work in like anything relating to the arts. A lot of times do have these kind of experiences where people, really unfortunately don't pay them for, their work. So I think you see this all the time, especially with someone that's like been commissioned to do some sort of art piece. That's why they usually will ask you to pay at least some portion of it like upfront. It's just because, like, over time, they've learned that, quite a few people basically are not keeping their word on that. So I think it's also something to consider based on, what side hustle you're going with. So again, I think another important consideration is to determine what you hope to gain out of doing a side hustle. I think that that should help you inform how much time you should be putting into it, and also what kind of activities or programs or services you're going to be offering. So for example, and I took all of these from this career website in terms of the terminology, but I think that this just was a pretty good way of, splitting them up categorically. So, for example, one of them would be emergency hustling. So that would be anytime someone needs to do a side hustle because they know they're going to be short on bills or something like that. So this one might not necessarily be something someone does all the time consistently. It might more so be something that someone does only when they find out that they're in financial need to do so. The next one is financially responsible. So that would be someone that knows that they might not have enough income as it currently is to save or put some money aside. So they are basically just using the side hustle and whatever income they generate from that to pay off maybe some outstanding debts or, to save. Then there's Make It Rain, which is a funny name, but basically that one is for anyone that makes extra money just to spend on, bags or vacations or stuff that maybe you don't necessarily need but want and that you can't really afford maybe on your current budget. And then freelance is pretty similar to some stuff that I described earlier, but basically, this is something that you don't necessarily consistently do. You more so do it once you have like a project or a contract or something like that. Um, and so it would depend. It's not like a constant thing. And then exploratory would be maybe doing a side hustle, then realizing that you can make it into more so a profitable sort of business, and then quitting your day job, as they say, and completely focusing your efforts onto that as a full-time job. More so than not, you usually see that with like e-commerce. So on an earlier slide, I talked about Shopify as one of the main ways that people do e-commerce these days. And so I think that you need to, of course, consider whether or not you're making enough money for you to support yourself before you do something like that. But for some people, like financially, they're just making way more money, especially if they've run a successful business or something like that. Um, so for them, it's more financially feasible to go into doing something that involves their side hustle. So I think now we're going to go into enhancing your side hustle skill sets. So the number one thing to kind of note off of this slide is that skill sets kind of fall into a bunch of different categories. I'm just going to quickly summarize them. So they're experiential, intrapersonal, interpersonal, professional. And this is just to name a few. I think depending on like what books you look into or what websites you're on, people will list off a bunch more in terms of categories. But I thought that these were just the most like pertinent ones to go over today. So going to start off with experiential. So anything experiential is stuff that basically you've actually done. So that includes any sort of work experience or internship experience or education, most commonly. And then intrapersonal would be anything that has to do with, yourself, basically. So that has to do with self-esteem, motivation, being in tune with your emotions, and a few other things, of course, as well. Interpersonal has to do with things like problem solving, listening skills, negotiation. So interpersonal is between people, and intra is within yourself. And then professional has to do with leadership, mentoring, project management, anything in those kind of realms. So, here are some websites that I would recommend you to check out in terms of ways to build your skill sets in a bunch of these different areas. So, the one on the top is called Allison Courses. They have quite a few different course certificates that you can earn for different areas of interest. I think the kind of pro for that one is that they have quite a few that are not in like STEM fields. Whereas I feel like Coursera, like mostly has stuff for, like, STEM fields. Um, but yeah, so that's just something to consider when you're looking into these kinds of things. And then Coursera, they actually have, like, course certificates, but then they have an option of a course, specialization. Personally, I think that those are pretty expensive. I think that you don't really need to do them unless they're having, like, some sort of promotion. Like, they had a promotion during, like, the period of, like, since COVID has been around basically to kind of be promoting, online learning and stuff like that, where you could earn free certificates for certain courses. But I think that expired in December. So I'm not necessarily sure when they're going to do another similar promotion like that again. But I definitely don't think that you need to be, shelling out $50 for, every single course. Um, but yeah. And then LinkedIn Learning is pretty good. I personally have it offered through my university. I think if you don't necessarily have it offered through your university or through like your student account, I don't know exactly how much it would be or whether or not it would be worth that amount of money. Because I am getting it for free, obviously, I think it's a very valuable resource at its current price of free. But I think that that would be something I is kind of on a case by case basis. LinkedIn Learning is also pretty good because obviously LinkedIn is a very professional sort of site, and any sort of course you finish on LinkedIn Learning can be directly added to your LinkedIn profile. So I think that that's just like a convenience sort of thing. Whereas for these other courses, you have to, you have to upload your certificate and update like your LinkedIn, and that takes like time. So I think that that's just something to keep in mind as well. So I think that since we've been doing some brainstorming, another thing that people need to consider when they're trying to decide what to do as a side hustle is to basically find your wow. So, some guiding questions to consider in regards to that are: when have I been the first or the best at something? What is the number one thing I've achieved at different points in my career or like academics or stuff like that? Or any of my extracurricular involvements? What of my achievements have the most impressive numbers? So, for example, like if you've been working on like social media for like a bunch of e-boards for clubs, then for example, that might be something that you're looking at while you're thinking about this. So another thing to consider is what have I been publicly recognized for? So if you've had any sort of like you've won any sort of competitions, like maybe like for piano or like academic competitions like the brain bee or something like that. Any sort of way that like you can solidly prove competency in something, first of all, tells you that you're good at it, especially if you work hard at it. And it also tells anyone else that would be buying probably like whatever you're selling in terms of those things that you are worth it because you have basically a track record to show for that. So I think that's important to think about. And then the last thing would be what are some things that you're personally proud of? So I think a lot of people, especially when you're like applying to like applying from high school to college or from college to like a job, they have things that they're proud of professionally because they know that that's going to look good to people in their, career field or, stuff like that. But I think the most important ones that you should be reflecting on are things that you are personally proud of, not anything that you think that other people are proud of you for. So I think a lot of people make that mistake by saying, "Oh, I medaled or I got top three in this sort of competition or something like that, and I got it consistently throughout high school. So that's something that I feel like I'm proud of." And that might be true, but I think for a lot of people that's not necessarily the thing that they're most personally proud of. And then, of course, like we talked about earlier, side hustles are a really good opportunity to also learn something. I think especially when, we're trying to do things, a lot of times we kind of try to avoid things that we're not good at. So a great way to kind of delve into trying something new without it, interfering with anything would be to try it in a low stakes environment first or try it before you, charge people for it. So, for example, like I know a friend that was really into learning how to crochet, which, believe it or not, quite a few people don't know how to do. So, basically, she started off with just making pretty simple designs and selling it, or not selling it even at the beginning, and giving it to family members and friends as presents. Getting feedback, kind of using it as time to practice and stuff like that. And buying more materials, expanding on that, maybe trying different kinds of threads or needles, or I'm not very familiar with crocheting, but I assume that they have different kinds of techniques, and then working her way up from that, she started selling them to friends for like a really nominal price, like let's say like $2 or $3 for like a small craft. And then after that, since she had some, practice and she had this track record of selling for a while, she was able to kind of work up to more complicated designs and sell for a bit of a higher price. So I don't think it's impossible, but I do definitely think that you need to have the time to commit to it, before you try to start, doing it. Okay. So I think that this is a really important category and also something to consider when you're working on a side hustle of any kind. So now we're going to be talking about having a sustainable impact and any sort of considerations relating to that. So I did borrow this graphic from my university's Ginsberg Center. And so basically, I'm going to be kind of going through these points, but I think that they are all very solid points in regards to a side hustle. So I think we can obviously start at the top and go through our way down. So we see here that it starts with what we do matters and how we do it matters too. And I think that that's really, really, really important. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about how their actions or what they're doing could be affecting others or maybe even like offensive to others until like they look at it in retrospect. So I think it's always important when you're starting to do something to think about what people you're impacting, and what are like basically the worst case scenarios. You should always be thinking about what the worst case scenario is for anything, so that you know what you're getting yourself into. So for example, I'm just going to point out a few of these. You want to start with the community. So I think for quite a few people, like when they're doing things, um, most of the time it's because that they have like an innate passion, like I've been talking about throughout this whole presentation. But a lot of people don't consider if there's actually also, on the other hand, a need. So obviously you're providing the supply, right? But if there's no demand, maybe like in your area or something like that, then it's not necessarily the most feasible thing to do. So for example, maybe like let's think about the photography thing. If like you're living in a neighborhood where everyone's like mostly like, 65 or older, they're like senior citizens, stuff like that. Um, you don't really have any kids, you don't really have any young couples that are like, having events and stuff like that. It might not be the best idea to get started on something with photography. Not to say that people that are older don't take pictures, but I'm just saying that I think people that are older take less pictures. So I think that that's something to consider. But I think another thing that people need to think about as well is whether or not you're going to be affecting any sort of small businesses by doing what you do. So for quite a few people, when you're starting out as like doing a side hustle or doing freelance work, you don't really charge very high prices because you just want to kind of get a name for yourself out there. You want people to know that maybe like you're new at this or not as experienced because maybe you didn't go to a professional school for it, but that you're still competent and capable and that they should pick you. So to be competitive in that kind of market, you price yourself lower. But for a lot of people that, is not good for their business because if you're coming in and saying, "Hey, I'm only going to charge $5 for this art piece or something like that." Then if someone goes to someone else that has, an established business and stuff like that and goes and says, "Well, my prices are like $100." Then clearly I think you can start to see where there becomes sort of an issue of people kind of disregarding or not giving their business to these small businesses. Which do have skill sets and do have a right to be charging the prices that they do. So you definitely want to consider that as well. You don't want to be putting anybody out of business or stuff like that. And then I think we can move to the next slide. So another thing to keep in mind is maybe in some way, if you want your side hustle to benefit something greater than just yourself, I think a really good kind of guide as to different areas in which you can contribute are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So as you can see here, they're all kind of listed out. And they do actually have some recommendations on their website of things you can do in relation to those. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do think that two birds with one stone would be obviously like the best thing you can do. If you're doing something to give back to the community and also earning money, I think that that's just a win win. So I think that that's just something that is good to think about when you're deciding what to do. Okay, and one other thing that I wanted to point out is that there's actually quite a few initiatives and stuff like that that are already pretty established. So in the US alone, this is not even a global number. There are 1.5 million not for profit organizations that are established and currently active. And numbers and numbers of nonprofit organizations, dissolve year to year. But that's like still such a massive number that if you think about it, it's not necessarily the most economical or proactive way to help a community to start something that has already been done several times. So that's another thing I think that people should also be keeping in mind too. That if you do want to start something, it should be because you think there's a genuine gap or a genuine thing that hasn't already been addressed. I think a lot of people want to start something just to start something, and I think that that's not a good idea. So. All right, so I'm gonna open it up now to any questions. You can type it in the chat since all of your microphones are disabled because it's a webinar. But I will stop the recording after I just say a couple more things. So, just a quick reminder, I would love if you guys could follow us on, our social media sites. And obviously, if you could subscribe to us on YouTube. So, there will be a recording also of this webinar on YouTube as well. So, I think that, if, you want to share this with any friends or stuff like that, you can go ahead and do that. I would encourage it. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased, but that would be great. And I think that it's just a really good way to, spread learning. That's completely free. Some people will charge you for stuff like this, and I don't really think that that's fair. So um, that's why we do it. And then obviously, our social media accounts are pretty much all the same name. I will say for Facebook, there's a one after it because someone already took the name, but it is what it is. So without further ado, I'm just gonna stop sharing the screen and turn the recording off so I can answer any questions.